Today we're going to build this simple keyboard stand using reclaimed wood. I got the idea for this project after setting up our Christmas tree and deciding that the metal keyboard stand I had was letting down the room a bit. I thought I could replace it with something that was both more practical and better looking. And I had some leftover wood from an old set of shelves that I'd rescued. I had three things I wanted to achieve with my design that the metal X-frame wasn't doing. First, I wanted it to be clean and minimal, something that actually adds to the room rather than just holding the keyboard up. Secondly, I wanted to reduce the visual weight. Digital pianos are surprisingly bulky, and I wanted this to feel lighter than it actually is. And third, I want full clearance underneath. I need space for my legs when I'm sitting down to play. The challenge was doing all three without overcomplicating the whole project. So the first thing to do was measure up and get some dimensions. My keyboard is the Roland FP10, but this design is so simple it could be adapted to any keyboard. What I noticed about the Roland is that the top half has a decent overhang. So instead of designing a shelf for the keyboard to sit on, I wanted the overhang to be supported and everything underneath it to be hidden. This way you'll only see the top half, helping with the visual weight, and also avoid blocking the downward facing speakers. I like the design, it's just a question of whether it'll work. I took the keyboard into the kitchen so I could reference it as I built. I trust my measurements, but it's always nice to be able to double check. These oak veneered MDF boards were salvaged, so I'm working with what I've got. Luckily, there's some good sized pieces in here, and I don't need loads of material. I started with the side pieces. These just needed marking out with a straight edge. When I don't have a ruler long enough, I tend to make do with another board and try to use a factory edge where I can. Because these boards are reclaimed, they did have some holes from old screws that needed filling. We've got a hardware store just round the corner, so I ran over and picked up some wood filler. It's darker than I'd have liked, but it's all they had. And the holes are only small, so it won't be a problem. There's probably a better way of applying this, but I went for the mush it in with your finger method. That worked, but was a bit messy, so I also tried a screwdriver. Either way, the holes got filled, and I used the orbital sander to clean up around them. The cut edges revealed the MDF core, which isn't very pretty, so I'm using iron-on edge banding. This is a thin strip of oak with a heat-activated glue on the back. You just roll it out and literally iron it onto the edge. This is one of those small details that helps with the clean and minimal look, with no raw edges distracting from the wood effect. They do make specific tools for trimming edge banding, but I don't have one, so this was my workaround. I started off by trimming what I could with a Stanley knife, and then used a sander to smooth down the rest. What I'm doing here is one of those moments where doing something wrong is actually the best solution. You see, an orbital sander should basically always be used flat. It's made for smoothing surfaces, and lifting it like this can risk gouging into your work. But I've been careful here. I'm using a fine grit and have turned the speed down. I'm actually using the rotation of the disc to make sure that the edge banding is always being pushed into the surface I've just stuck it to. If I use the sander flat, then the back half of the disc will be trying to pull the edge away, and will be likely to either break it away or split the wood. To match the other furniture in our living room, I decided I was going to stain the keyboard stand. I'm not usually a big fan of wood stain, and probably wouldn't have done this if it was solid oak, but I'm not so precious about veneer. So I'm separating a piece of scrap into three to test out the wood stains I found in the back of our cupboard. I have genuinely no idea how long these have been here, but I gave them a good shake before opening, and the fumes didn't knock me out when I opened the lids, so it's probably alright. I tore up an old t-shirt to use for rags, and wiped on a coat of each stain. We'll come back to these later and see how they dry. In the meantime, I'll carry on getting the frame together. The next step was cutting a long, thinner piece for the front, which needed to be just wide enough to hide the bottom half of the keyboard. I wanted to keep it thin to give the stand an elegant look, but also so it wouldn't get in the way of my legs when I go to sit under it. There's no point in it looking good if it's uncomfortable to actually play. I always prefer to take measurements directly where I can, so I'm laying out the legs next to the keyboard to make a mark for the length. I want this stand to be easy to take apart, in case I need to move it in the future, so I'm going to just put it together with screws. I pre-drilled and countersunk the holes, and then used the drill bit as a kind of punch to transfer the hole positions onto the front piece. I made sure to label which side was left and right, just in case there were any small differences in alignment. Now I could finally get an idea of what this was going to look like, and check whether the concept actually worked. I drop the keyboard in, and what do you know? Pretty good. That front piece hides the bottom half of the keyboard really well, so it looks half as thick as it actually is. The stand was already surprisingly sturdy just like that, but it needed a back to give it some additional strength. I marked the length and used the same process of pre-drilling, countersinking and punching to attach it. I'm installing this lower down so there's still full access to the ports on the back of the keyboard. The width of the back panel stops the stand twisting or wobbling. Back to more edge banding. The top surfaces all need a strip adding to cover up that MDF edge. As a woodworker, I have a tendency to think that solid wood is always better. There is something about the craftsmanship that goes into a piece of solid wood furniture that's rarely found in anything made of engineered boards. That being said, this project has convinced me that engineered boards have their place in my material toolkit. I built this in a day, and could have done it quicker if I wasn't filming too. I didn't have to mill the boards from rough sawn timber, I didn't have to think about splits or grain direction, or worry about them twisting after the project's finished. I'm proud of the way this looks, but it's not an heirloom piece that's meant to last generations. It's quick and practical, and veneered MDF turned out to be the perfect material. The fact that the wood was recycled from something that didn't have a use anymore just gives this piece more of a story. With the edge banding finished, I sanded up to 120 grit with the orbital sander, being careful not to go through the thin veneer. The wood had some colour variation, both from its original finish when it was a set of shelves, but also from where some areas had been exposed to light and others hadn't. Sanding evened out the variation, but didn't remove it completely. That's part of the reason I decided to use stain on this project. After checking back on the stain tests, I settled on the dark oak colour, which wiped on with a rag. I used a generous coat, maybe a little too generous on that back panel, and wiped off the excess after it had soaked in. This particular tin is a coloured varnish rather than just a stain, so it gives the surface some protection too. After that was dry, I brought everything to the living room, ready for assembly. This whole project is made of just 4 panels and 6 screws, so it goes together really easily. The keyboard drops right in, and all that was left to do was plug it in and tidy up the wires. There's nothing worse than a nice clean setup with wires just dangling down the back, so I used a couple of screws and zip ties to hide everything. And that's it, a simple keyboard stand made from recycled wood. I'd say it checks off my 3 criteria, so I'm happy, particularly for a one-day build. I hope this gives you some inspiration or motivation to make something yourself. If you enjoyed it, then subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.